Welcome. In this video, we are going to answer the essential questions, describe the function of a kidney in excreting metabolic wastes and expelling them into the environment, and identify the role of ADH and aldosterone in water and sodium ion reabsorption, excretion, and blood pressure regulation. Some of the key vocabulary that you're going to hear includes kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, urethra, antidiuretic hormone or ADH, and aldosterone. So let's talk a little bit about what the excretory system means. Now, what you have to understand is in Bio 20, we focus on the urinary system, which is part of the larger body's way of excreting waste. So when I say the excretory system or the excretory system, whatever you want to call it, you have to understand it's any time that the body is eliminating waste. So your lungs or your respiratory system has a role in the excretion, because when we breathe, we release CO2, which is a waste, H2O and heat. Think about your skin. When you're sweating, you're releasing salt and heat and more water. Your large intestines, your digestive system, has a big part of that with indigestible materials, which is your feces. Your liver gets rid of things like heavy metals and toxins, and your kidneys get rid of urea and uric acid, which can turn into toxins. So just remember, when we say excretory system in Bio 20, we use it interchangeably with the urinary system, but that doesn't mean we're just... Sometimes people would be talking about the bigger picture. So when I talk about the urinary system, I'm talking about how my body maintains water balance, ion balance, and gets rid of the metabolic waste. So metabolic waste is a really fancy way to say when your body does chemical reactions, there's sometimes byproducts or waste products that our body can't have inside of it. It has to go. Like, for example, we can't have hydrogen peroxide in our bodies. When our body makes that by accident, it has to also be able to get rid of that. So urea, uric acid, really common. Ammonia is very toxic and we must get rid of it. And it's all about regulating the composition of our blood. So you have to remember, our blood is made up of a lot of water. And if we don't remove the water from the blood, it can change the composition of that blood. So the principal structures are the renal artery and the renal vein. So fancy words for the major artery running to the kidneys and the major vein running out of the kidneys. And you can see, if I have my pen here, there you go. You can see there's the renal artery and there's the renal vein. The blue and red kind of give you an indication of which one's oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. Think of it this way. The artery is carrying blood away from the heart, right? A's and A's. So the artery brings blood into the kidneys clean it, and then the veins run it back out and take it to the rest of the body. You have what's called the ureter, the urinary bladder, the urethra, the kidneys, and then inside the kidneys are what are called nephrons, and they're actually the part of the kidney that does the work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each thing. So remember, the renal artery comes from the aorta, from the heart, all the way to the kidneys. The renal vein is what's connected to that inferior vena cava that takes it back into the heart. Your ureter is the tube, and you can see it here on the picture. It's this tube right here. Your ureter is what carries the urine that's made in your kidneys down into your bladder down here. And it's lined with mucus to protect the walls from that acidity or from that toxin. It's also got smooth muscles that are involuntary to do peristalsis, kind of like your esophagus does. That's basically how it gets urine down into the bladder. The urinary bladder, so here's a picture of a cross section. It's in a female, the urinary bladder in this picture. You can see the ureters coming in, and essentially it is a muscular organ. It has two rings. It has a sphincter that's internal. So the sphincters up here are involuntary, mean that as urine comes down into the bladder, we can't control that. It's right here that external sphincter is a voluntary control, and we all know about that you can hold pee, or sometimes you lose control and you end up going to the bathroom. Think about it this way: 200 to 400 milliliters. So a cup to a cup and a half, maybe 2 cups is your max volume that you can hold in your bladder, and 600 milliliters you will definitely lose control. You will empty about 1.5 liters if you're hydrated in 24 hours. Then there's the urethra, and the urethra is this down here that takes from your bladder to the external part in your body. You have to remember it's longer in males than it is in females because it travels down the penis out of the male. Then you have the kidneys, and like I said to you, the kidneys actually have nephrons, which are the things that you can see, these kind of squiggles that you can see almost look like worms. Each kidney, you have 2 of them. They're about a ½ kilogram each. They're in the back side wall of your abdominal cavity. At any given time, you can have about 1/4 of your blood there, and the whole job of the kidney is to filter that blood and make urine. There's 3 layers. There's called what's the outer layer, which is called the renal cortex, which is here. Then you have the inner medulla, which is this here. And then you have the renal pelvis, which is there, the inner chamber that's hollow. So the nephron, like I said, is that functional part of the kidney. And we'll talk a lot more about the nephron in the next video. But basically what happens is the top of the nephron is in the renal cortex, that outer layer of the kidney. And then into the medulla dips the second part of the nephron, and then the collecting duct part of the nephron, and you can't see it down here, but this is the renal pelvis area. The collecting duct comes into the renal pelvis. This picture is huge and not to scale. There's approximately 1 million in each kidney. So really, the whole job of the urinary system is to maintain homeostasis. And it can do that through 2 ways I'm going to talk about. These are the 2 ways I'm going to discuss. There's what's called water regulation or osmoregulation. And this is all about taking the water content of the blood either up or down. And so remember, negative feedback loop. And you have to think of it this way. If there is a decrease, so there's the negative, there's a decrease in the H2O in the blood. The H2O, and you think about, here's your cells, and there's my blood vessel beside it, right? So osmosis, grade 10, right? Osmosis, what we're going to see happen is there isn't as much water in the blood. So what's happened to the cells is they're shrinking because they don't have enough water. So what is going to happen is water is going to move from the cells to the blood, increasing the osmotic pressure. We're going to see a shrinking of the cell. And what's going to happen is you're going to get these little receptors in here, kind of like the receptors that we see in our heart or in our blood vessels for pressure. They're called osmoreceptors, so water osmoreceptors, that detect this idea that when you decrease the blood water levels, what are you going to do? You are going to either increase or decrease the pressure, right? So when we see this detection in pressure change in the blood, we get thirsty and we release what's called ADH, so the antidiuretic hormone. What it does is it works in the nephron, and it actually gets more water to reabsorb into the blood. And when we talk about the nephron, we can talk about that again. But basically what happens is the more water in the blood means more water in the cells, and then it brings your pressure back to normal. Of that negative feedback loop. So you can see there's the osmotic pressure, meaning the water pressure of the fluids. You have your control center, your receptors. So you have the osmoreceptors, you have the control center, which is your kidneys, and then you have that sensor, the effector, which is making that change. So decrease in the amount of water in the blood, cells shrink, you drink, you release ADH, which encourages reabsorption of water, and you are able to level out the water in the blood again. So there's a very simplified diagram of the negative. Another negative feedback loop you might look at is blood pressure regulation. So this is all about blood volume, and you have to think about this. Remember, if you have lots of volume, you're going to have more pressure on the walls of the arteries. If you have less volume, you'll have less pressure. And so baroreceptors are what they're called, that detect low pressure. They release what's called an enzyme renin, which goes and activates something called angiotensin. That angiotensin is what works on your blood vessels. It constricts them and then releases what's called aldosterone. That goes from the adrenal gland of your in your brain, and it goes down into the kidneys. It acts on the kidneys and the nephrons, and basically sodium gets released, or the increase of sodium transport. And when there's sodium, you're going to have water follow that to equal out those concentrations. And this increases the fluid level, changing the blood pressure. So I did a version of that. So change in blood pressure, renin, which activates angiotensin. We constrict the blood vessels, which makes sense because the smaller the blood vessel, the pressure will go up. We get aldosterone released. Because of that, we get an increase in sodium, which is in the form of salt reabsorption. And because of the salt being reabsorbed, guess what follows? Water, making the fluid level increase. which brings my blood pressure back into balance. So at the end of this video, you should be able to describe the kidney, the function of the kidney, and you should be able to tell me about ADH or aldosterone in the water, and just how it does the regulation, how it does homeostasis. So these would be the examples of your negative feedback loops for this unit.